Hello, hello. It's me, Johan, and today I'm going to be diving into the realm known as booktube. I actually enjoy reading books just as much as I do listening to music, and yeah, just it doesn't hurt to film something new every now and then. So, yeah, that's what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be talking about all the books that I read last year in 2024. I read one book each month, and I think that's just the perfect pace for me to go. And yeah, let's not waste time. Let's get right to it. Here are all the books that I read last year in 2024. Alrighty, kicking things off at the month of January, we got After the Ecstasy, The Laundry by Jack Kornfield. For those who don't know, Jack Kornfield is not only an author, but he's also a meditations specialist and a practitioner of the Theravada branch of Buddhism. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. What I like most about this book is that it takes a very grounded and humanistic approach to the whole idea surrounding enlightenment and spirituality. There's nothing high and mighty about it, which is cool and nice to see for a change, considering how this topic is often very preachy, at least in other people's works that I've come across. And to add to that, at least from what I gathered, Jack doesn't really have an agenda here. And if he did, the agenda would be just the overall health of the everyday person, mentally, physically, and spiritually, which is the only agenda that really matters at the end of the day. So yeah, Jack Kornfield's After the Ecstasy was a great read. It was a very easy read. And that's how I started off my year in January. Up next for February, we got a book that was running rampant on TikTok, and that was Simon Jimenez's The Spear Cuts Through Water. February was for fantasy, specifically a fantasy written by a fellow Filipino author. February, fantasy, fellow Filipino. That's 4 Fs. This thing is definitely a slow burn, especially throughout the first 100 or so pages, but man, is it worth it once you reach this certain checkpoint. I'm not going to say what it is because I don't want to spoil it, but those who have read this book, there's a certain point where things just start to pick up, and at least for me, in my mind, things were just clicking, and I was like, this is sick. You can't blame Simon either, just because like it's a standalone fantasy book, and because of that, there's obviously a lot to pack in. And yet, though it is a slow burn, I feel like it couldn't have been paced any other way. And then going back to book talk and even booktube, the main consensus with The Spear Cuts Through Water is that it reads like a Studio Ghibli movie, which not only do I 100% agree with, but I also feel like that's the only way that one can describe this book, if anyone could describe this book. I love this thing so much. The lore is phenomenal. The characters are great. The structure is unusual, but I welcomed it with open arms, and hopefully if you do read this, you'll love it just as much as I did. So yeah, A Spear Cuts Through Water by Simon Jimenez. Thank you, Simon Jimenez. Obviously, part 2 of the Dune movie came out in March of last year, so naturally it just felt right to pick up the book and reread it. Yeah, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about Dune just because it's Dune. I look at it the same way that I look at the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Like, there's just so much on the internet and even within your own discussions among friends that you could talk about, or that has been said already, so much so that I don't know how I could contribute to the discussion on here. Frank Herbert wrote a sci-fi masterpiece. Like, the world building is great, the character building, the planetary system, the politics. I will say I haven't read any of the other Dune books. I've only read this one. Maybe I'll pick up Messiah before Denis Villeneuve comes out with the Dune Messiah movie. Speaking of the movies, Dune Part 2 was definitely my favorite movie to come out of 2024 for sure. Well, that and Conclave, those two movies, those two were the best. So April last year was interesting in the sense that I read 10 books, kinda. Basically what happened was I was in LA for most of April, and I was kind of afraid that I wouldn't get any good reading in. I was wrong. For one of my birthdays, one of my best friends, Chase, she gave me Souvankham Thammavongsa's How to Pronounce Knife. Thank you, Chase. So I read that book and finished it on the flight on the way to LA. On the flight coming back here to Toronto, I had the first two books in the Bone comic series. So I read those two on the flight back and then finished the rest of the series when I got home. So I guess we'll talk about How to Pronounce Knife first. It's basically a collection of short stories written from the perspective of Southeast Asian immigrants in Canada, as Souvankham is Laotian. Yeah, many of the feelings and perspectives told in her short stories are eerily relatable to me, as I am also Southeast Asian. There are a lot of innuendos and just topics that are very uncomfortable to read about just because of how I relate to them so much. So yeah, it was a very important read. With the Bone series, I've had the collection since elementary school. I have all 9 of those books. I have all 9 of the comic books, including the additional prologues and epilogues and the short stories that came from the Bone series as well. I read through all of them at least once a year. So I guess April was just that month for that routinely reading of the Bone series. I think it's safe to say that I got some good ample reading in April. My read for the month of May got the most out of me emotionally. The first book by Khaled Hosseini that I read was And the Mountains Echoed. I read it in school. Yeah, I loved it. That book revolves around the relationship between a brother and a sister, which I relate to because I'm very close with my brother. So yeah, I naturally loved that book. Yeah, I just felt that the next step was to check out either Kite Runner or A Thousand Splendid Suns. And yeah, I picked the latter. And oh boy. Let me preface by saying this. I'm not the most emotionally reactive person, especially when it comes to the consumption of media of any kind. But I shit you not when I tell you that this book made me want to jump into the story and fight a certain someone. I won't spoil it here, but for those who have read it, you know exactly who I'm talking about. I think it's safe to say that this thing got me heated. The only other piece of fiction that has ever gotten this venomous reaction out of me would be Nocturnal Animals, that movie by Tom Ford. Both these things made me want to fight a certain somebody. And by a certain somebody, I mean a certain someone in those stories, because they're awful people. I hope this doesn't come across as if I'm saying that this book is bad. This book is quite the read. It's amazing. All I gotta say is, if you're gonna read this with caution, because it will get you heated. If you're a history nerd, and specifically a nerd for music history, then Ian Winwood's Bodies, Life and Death in Music is definitely something that you should check out. Ian is a seasoned music journalist coming from the UK, and a lot of the bands and just the time periods that he talks about here take place in the late 90s and early 2000s. So if you like bands from that point in time, then maybe this is something that you should check out as well. To summarize this book quickly, Ian basically talks about all the shitty things that happen within the music industry, from the exploitation of artists to, mental health and addiction and stuff like that. So yeah, with that in mind, I would personally issue a trigger warning for those who are hypersensitive to those topics, just because a lot of what Ian covers here can be disturbing. But regardless, this thing is a very important read. Yeah, if you're a music history nerd, if you're a musician yourself, or you're just interested in this kind of thing, Bodies, Life and Death of Music is definitely a book that you should check out. My book for July was probably the one that I was looking forward to most, if I remember it correctly. And that book was 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel García Márquez. When I picked it up, I couldn't wait for it to come up on my queue, and for good reason. Yeah, for context, Gabriel García Márquez was a Colombian author, and he was one of the main pioneers for magical realism. But for me personally, the whole magical realism aspect was secondary to me as to why I love this one so much. The primary reason as to why I love this book so much was just because of how relatable it is. Let me explain. The Buendia family is so familiar to me. Like, I resonate so much with how their family is structured and how each member has a certain role that they play. Like in my own family, there's definitely a Jose Arcadio, there's definitely an Ursula, there's even a friggin' Melquiades. And even me, like, I personally relate heavily with Aureliano. Yeah, I definitely understand, especially for those who read this for the first time, I definitely understand that the many family members, most of whom share the same name, can be quite jarring to take in if you come from a big ass family like me. It's nothing new. I also want to shout out the Netflix adaptation of this book as well. I think they did a phenomenal job. You know, it's shot really well. That actors are exactly how I envisioned the characters to be when I was reading this book. The Netflix adaptation was a pleasant surprise, and I can't wait for part 2 to come out. 100 Years of Solitude is a classic for a reason. A lot of people regard it as the greatest novel of all time. I haven't read enough books to say that, but at least for me, this is definitely one of my favorites for sure. My August read was another classic book, and that was Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance by Robert M. Pirsig. This book is basically about a father-son duo who travel via motorcycle from Minnesota to Northern California. Pirsig uses a motorcycle as like an analogy for just one's life, one's relationships, and motorcycle maintenance can be looked at as a way to maintain one's life. This is also a very philosophical book. Specifically within the field of epistemology. I'll be honest, August was a very busy month for me, so I did read this kind of passively, which is unfair. I know it doesn't do this book justice, but upon first read, I will say that though the philosophical part of the book is the main point of reading this book in the first place, I was definitely more interested in just the plot, like, you know, the relationship between the father and his son. This is definitely worth a reread on my part, and if you haven't read this already, please go pick it up. Yeah, my read for September was Madeline Miller's Circe. I'm already a huge fan of Greek history and mythology, so going into this, I knew that at the very least, I would think that this thing would be okay. Safe to say that this book definitely exceeded any and all expectations. Madeline Miller is just a good storyteller, and Circe is just a good story. You know, it's hella fun and super creative, especially in its retelling of certain Greek myths, most notably the Odyssey. That's all I have to say. I don't know what else to say about Circe. It's just such a good story. Yeah, September was definitely a solid month for reading. That's 100% for sure. And on the complete other side of things, my read for October was Between Two Fires by Christopher Buehlman. This is a medieval horror book that takes place in France, a France that was completely destroyed by the Black Plague. You know, the setting is dark, it's grim. This was the only book that I read in 2024 that made me smell things. Like, you could smell the death in this book. Yeah, I love the concept of Christopher Buehlman's world here. Like, I love the lore, I love the story, I love the Christian motifs that were written in here that made things all the more terrifying. As awesome as this book is, I do have two main criticisms. The first one being that my favorite character was killed off way too early. And I'm not just saying that because he's my favorite character, but he could have been ushered in towards the end of the story a little bit more. Like, the plot could have used more of him. Speaking of the end, my second criticism is that it wrapped up way too quickly for my liking, at least, especially given how dire the conflict and just the general plot of the story was. You would think that everything would unravel at a steadier pace. Regardless of what my criticisms are, this thing is awesome. It's disturbing, it's horrifying, but it's also action-packed. Yeah, not only am I going to check out Buehlman's other works, but I'm also going to check out more things within the medieval horror niche. Yeah, and it's all thanks to this book, Between Two Fires. My read for November was another collection of short stories, and this time it was by Anton Chekov. Obviously, Chekov is one of the big names within Russian literature, specifically within the realm of plays and short stories. Yeah, I was already familiar with his short story, The Lady with the Little Dog, which I liked. So yeah, I just decided to pick up a copy that had this story, as well as a bunch of others. And I gotta be honest, I didn't really enjoy this one as much as I thought. Quite frankly, I found most of the short stories here to be kind of drab. And I say that because most of them are character focused, which is important, of course, but not to the point where it's just all character and no plot. Obviously, too, a lot of these stories are very much in relation to 19th century Russia, which are a country and a period of time that I obviously don't relate to. This collection of short stories was definitely not my favorite. It was actually my least favorite from everything that I've read in 2024. I didn't DNF it though, so there's that. And finally, last but not least, my December read was Barney's version by Canadian author Mordechai Richler. Richler or Rickler? I don't know. Yeah, this thing is funny, man. There are definitely like instances and lines in the book that when I read them, I was just like, eh. The whole premise surrounding the book is basically just Barney, who's an older fella, is basically sitting you down and telling you about all the bullshit that he got up to in his younger life. Yeah, and kind of the same sentiment with 100 Years of Solitude. There are so many characters in here that I don't personally find relatable, but that I've definitely come across within my life, and that just makes the book a lot funnier. After reading this thing too, I also watched the movie adaptation that came out in 2010 that had Paul Giamatti in it, and I will watch anything that has Paul Giamatti in it. Yeah, the movie was great overall. This book was great overall, and it made for a great read to end off my 2024 with. Well, there we have it, everybody. Those are all the books that I read last year in 2024. My favorites are definitely 100 Years of Solitude and Circe. Those two books will definitely have a permanent place in my small bookshelf. Will I continue the whole one book a month thing this year? I don't know. We'll see. But I'd say that I'm starting off 2025 pretty strong. My TBR is pretty full, but nevertheless, please let me know in the comments what books I should check out next or what your favorite books are. Yeah, with that being said, thank you guys again for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one where we return to talking about music. Yeah, have a good one.